Hi everyone, I'm Carrie, a Janeite who sews, and welcome to my channel. I'm a teacher by profession, and it's only natural, I guess, that I would end up wanting to teach as I learn about historical fashion and making my own historical gowns. I hope this video will be helpful to those of you wanting to make your own robe à la Française, or saque back gown, or inspire you to make some other historical garment, or entertain you as I struggle through this project, but end up making something I like. Spoiler alert, yay, there's a happy ending. My girly pink childhood was epitomized by my love and adoration for strawberry shortcake, but my teenage formative years were during the height of the 90s alternative rock and grunge scene. I eschewed the color pink, flowers, bows, and in general cutesy or frilly feminine clothing, and instead wore flannel shirts, loose jeans, t-shirts, and skater shoes, even though I couldn't skateboard to save my life, and enough eyeliner to put raccoons to shame. I've abandoned the eyeliner, but comfy and not super feminine clothes are still my MO in my daily life. I want to be able to tromp about the woods or at a rock outcrop at a moment's notice. I suppose I've come full circle, or I'm acknowledging that side of me that does want to dress like a super fancy tea treat. I blame or give credit to the splendiferous costumers in my two sewing groups and the Great British Bake Off. Who doesn't want to look as pretty as their delicious artwork? Also, my friend Christine, or Sewstein as many of you know her on social media and YouTube, came up with the idea for a sewing challenge for the St. Louis Historical Sewing Society. The Macaron Challenge, inspired by Sophia Coppola's Marie Antoinette. The rules, or guidelines if you will, are as follows. 1750s to 1780s-ish, pastel macaron tones, big hair, and finished by April 2020. This was pre-pandemic, and now we're planning on an 18th century macaron event in our costumes that we make for this challenge whenever the pandemic is over. So like 2022, 2030, I don't know. Anyway, I stayed home for the holidays and finished my very first robe à la Française, or Ralph as I called it. As in, Ralph, why are you not cooperating with me? Most of this video will be about how I use the American Duchess Simplicity pattern with the American Duchess Guide to 18th Century Dressmaking, with modifications based on Patterns of Fashion 1 by Janet Arnold, Costuming Close Up, and Costume in Detail, and my own intuition. I'm not saying this is the right way to make this style of gown. The sheer diversity in extant saque gowns would make any such proclamation foolhardy, but it ended up working for me. I want to share my experience in case you have access to the same resources and want to avoid my mistakes. Given my measurements, I used the largest size in my pattern packet, a 12. I then made a mock-up of the bodice lining to ensure I was on the right track. I learned from fixing my Italian gowns that the shoulder strap should be separate from the bodice front to ensure the bodice is more on the bias for a bit of stretch around the curve of your torso and stays, and the shoulder strap should be on the straight of grain for strength and less stretch. So I folded over the pattern piece and cut separate bodice fronts and shoulder straps. Make sure you adjust the fold of the pattern piece each time to give yourself seam allowance. I also left some fabric in the armhole because I have small arms and I always end up putting in a gusset when I make an 18th century gown. Sometimes size 12 was too big, so I had to bring in each side seam 1/2 inch, which I figured out by pinching in on myself on both sides, getting my husband to repin it, and then measuring each side from the original seam line. The mock-up also confirmed my suspicions about the armhole and that I am very short-waisted. I did not make another mock-up to fix these problems before moving on to the linen because impatience, but at least I was aware of them. As you can see, I machine sewed the mock-up, but I decided to try hand sewing the entire gown itself to more fully embody the practices of the past and my mantua maker foremothers. I regretted this self-imposed rule many times because it took me so long, like several months, no, just a month and a half. And I'm here to say, if you want to machine sew an entire historical gown, even if the time period is long before the invention of the sewing machine, you go for it. You and your project are still valid. And that will be me during my next 2 projects at least. I pretty much followed the instructions in the American Duchess book for constructing the bodice lining with a sturdy linen. I raised the waistline a full inch above the original seam line, and the side seams still needed adjusting, possibly because of the difference in fabrics used from the mock-up and the lining. My husband helped me with the repinning. Then it was time to cut my lovely Cimarron silk taffeta from the Silk Baron. The American Duchess book authors used or simulated the historically available 20-inch panels of silk for the gown and petticoat, but I didn't mess with that so I could avoid some seams. You can see what I did here. I taped piece 3 and piece 4, pattern piece 3 and pattern piece 4 together, so the back and the side back. The reason that they're split here originally is because historically silk widths were not very wide. They were about 20 inches wide. But modern silk widths are, well, mine is 55 inches or 54, I don't remember. And so I just combined these two, which are a little over 21 each, and that meant that I didn't have to create this seam right here. And I thought I would save myself some trouble, but I am having trouble right here. I cut out and made the petticoat after cutting out the fabric for the gown to make sure I had enough silk. Because you can always make the back of the petticoat out of something else, because it won't show under the gown, which reaches the floor. Turns out I had plenty. The paper pattern says I should end up using 14.5 yards of 60-inch fabric for a size 12. And I ended up using 9 yards of 55-inch wide silk for the entire gown. Maybe I did something horribly wrong, but I like the gown and how it turned out, so whatever. My petticoat panels are 43-inch long rectangles without faux seams, although I did use the pleating guide from the paper pattern, and it worked perfectly. Like, I'm surprised how perfectly. My openings at the top for the pocket seams, which I forgot initially to put in the gown, are 7 inches long rather than the 10 to 12 suggested by the book, because my hoops and my body are, I don't know, narrower, I guess. So make sure you check before you decide where to make the pocket slits in both your petticoat and your gown. I somehow got an extra pleat in the petticoat front and had to take off the waist tape in that spot and zhuzh, technical term, the pleat back in the right direction. I do this way more frequently when machine sewing. I ignored the suggestion in the book to put the trim on before sewing the side seams of the petticoat because, again, I wanted to gauge how much fabric I had left before deciding on trim. Plus, trim is like frosting to me, and it just seems like it should be done after the cake or the gown is constructed. Next came the Watteau pleats, emblematic of Ralph's. These have intimidated me since I first bought my AD book 2 years ago, and why I took so long to make this style of gown. I practiced on mock-up fabric, and I'm still not sure I did it correctly, but it looked right, so I proceeded with my silk. I marked all pleating lines with a pink friction pen that I could hardly see, but I was afraid a darker pen would leave a permanent mark. It turns out these pen marks don't completely disappear from this silk, even with ironing. So make sure you always test them first. I'm an awkward pleater, and I really need a bigger sewing table, but you get the idea. Sewing down these pretty pleats was pretty satisfying. I'm getting ready to sew the back of the bodice down to the lining, and I was a little confused the first time I read the book about how to actually do this, but I smoothed out and felt for the crease of the back pleat, and then I pinned that down on both sides, and then I just confirmed on the lining side that those pins are parallel to the opening at the back, and in general about the same distance from these seams, or from these edges here. And so now I'm going to prick stitch them down. Actually, I'm going to stab stitch. I have been calling stab stitch a prick stitch, and that is not accurate. The side back seam of the bodice lining should be fitted on the body like in the AD book. And then, like I do here, you can smooth the fashion fabric over it, fold over, and make the edge a gentle curve, and then stitch it down. The book says to prick stitch, but I stab stitched it. I am in love with this color, I am in love with this silk, I'm in love with this pattern, except that I made a mistake. Because when I adjusted the waistband to fit my own relatively short waist, which means I ended up folding it, but for some reason there's now a gap here. I guess I'm gonna make a strip and attach it to the top of this piece so that it will actually go under there. So on piece 4, oh, cat, okay, cat. I recommend, so that this doesn't happen to you, I recommend cutting it out like here if you are short-waisted, because if you are adjusting the waistline up, then you're gonna end up having trouble here, which is what I am doing right now. Because then if you cut it all the way out up here, then you can just cut away any excess later instead of having to add a strip, which is what I'm going to have to do here on the side back. I folded down a very small, less than 1/4 inch strip of the top of the skirt panel and stitched an extra strip to it so that I could actually attach it to the waistline of the bodice without weird crumpling at the back. This silk looks different from different angles though, and I neglected to cut it out at the same angle. Here you can see my version of the Mantua Maker's seam, where I lazily clipped instead of basting. And it probably took me longer, but whatever, please don't at me. It was impossible for me to fit the gown skirt to the bodice on myself, and my husband was often at work, so I did it on my not perfectly me dress form and did many of the markings at my sewing table. I almost cried at least 7 times during this process and wished I could float out of my body and fit it on myself, but it turned out good enough. At some point during every project, I have to say screw it and move forward, or I'll never finish anything. Finally sewing the skirt seam was a huge relief, even if it's not perfect. Done is better than not done. Then came the sleeves, usually my arch nemesis. Lucky for me, earlier sleeves on Ralph's were not quite as fitted, so I felt any wrinkles could be passed off as mid-century. I did use a string to measure the armhole of the sleeves against the circumference of my own arm and found it, even the smallest size, to be way too big. So I redrafted the sleeve using the guide on page 187. The sleeve lining is optional, but I sweat, so it wasn't for me. And I like the historical method of creating a sleeve with no raw edges, but just one seam. Next came the sleeve flounces. The AD book recommends attaching them before attaching the sleeves to the gown, and despite my cake before frosting mentality, I decided to follow this instruction, probably because I was procrastinating and did not want to go through sewing the sleeves onto the gown. Anyway, I offset the top of the two flounces before whip gathering to create greater visual appeal. Even though I measured how long the gathered portion needed to be to go around the sleeve plus seam allowance, I ended up being short. And really wished I hadn't made knots so often, because I had to cut the knots, cut the ends, regather them more loosely, and then seam them before they would fit on the sleeves. The knots are great if your thread breaks, but I double my thread when I whip gather, and I use strong polyester thread. Hey. Now I knot much less frequently, so I can adjust more at the end. My husband helped me fit the sleeves in the 18th century manner described in the AD book by pinning the underside and part of the top, and then I did the rest of the fitting on my dress form. I did not fiddle much with the sleeve fit because I'd learned my lessons from my Italian gowns and I wanted to move on. I opted for the neck back binding rather than turning down the edge like in the AD book. I modeled mine after the one in Costume Close Up, Gown 2, page 17. Next, I made the stomacher. Again, cake before frosting. I wasn't going to touch the trim until this last foundational part of the gown was done. Based on my measurements, I did not have to modify the paper pattern piece for the stomacher except to make it one piece instead of a two piece that closes with hooks and eyes. If anything, my stomacher is a bit too big because I was afraid of making it the opposite. I constructed it pretty much like in the AD book. I feel like trim is where you can really sew your personality. I decided to go for meandering smushed ruffles, cut with scalloped pinking shears, and little flowers with pearls. I took the paper pattern template for the narrow skirt trim, which was 3 1/16 inches wide at its widest, and narrowed it about an inch. I sort of modeled the meandering after the yellow Ralph at the Met, but instead of buttons, I added these little flowers, which are just the narrow trim cut in half lengthwise and then gathered up and sewn into a circle, then attached with a pearl in the middle. I also changed up the petticoat trim a bit by making the bottom of the template the top and then making bigger scallops at the bottom, more like Madame de Pompadour's gown in this painting. I finally figured out I needed cardboard templates because the paper is not durable. For all the pinked trim, I traced it, then cut with the pinking shears right inside the lines. Emma helped me with the tracing. I'm sure she had nothing to do with me taking so long. My trim goes almost all the way around across the front of the petticoat, even though a lot of it won't be seen because it is covered by the gown. You see the same thing in some extents, especially where they tie up the sides, sort of like a polonaise gown. I wanted my gown trim to be extra sinuous, like the meandering streams I've lived near most of my life. Sinuosity is measured by dividing the distance along a stream channel between 2 points by the straight line distance between those points, and the sinuosity of the trim in the paper pattern is closer to 1, like in a mountain stream, whereas I wanted something much larger than that, like the Ohio River. So I traced a line on cardboard and cut it out as a template I could trace on both sides of the gown front, thereby increasing the likelihood they would be symmetrical. Then I measured the distance along the stream channel, or trim line, to figure out how much wide skirt trim I would need. I narrowed the pattern template by 1.5 inches for this trim. I also added little flowers with pearls. I had to stop myself from sewing on an entire garden, maybe for a future gown. Ooh, and with ribbon flowers too. Then finally, I worked on the lacy sleeve flounces and neck tucker. There is no paper pattern piece for any of these, so for the sleeve flounces, I used the self fabric lower flounce pattern piece and modified it. I cut 3 flounces out of cotton mull using this template, each 1 inch longer than the last, and then whip gathered vintage cotton lace and sewed it to the bottom of each. The mull is a different color than the lace, so I sewed an extra 5 rows of gathered lace to the inside of the bottom flounce so that it appears my arm is emerging from frothy goodness, and well, because I wanted to. The lace is very tightly woven, so I was able to cut it in half lengthwise and whip gather it to a 1/4 inch cotton tape and then sew the tape to the neckline of the gown. I made 2 separate tuckers, one for the top of the stomacher and the other around the side and back necklines of the gown, so I wouldn't have to worry about pinning or tucking it in once dressed like in the AD book. I could not have finished this gown without the resources made available by American Duchess. Thank you, ladies, and the encouragement of my costuming friends and followers during each step. I appreciate you all. I learned a lot about historical practice, and when I diverge from it, because I think I know an easier way, which is not always the case. It was interesting using both the AD book and the pattern. Both were so helpful in different ways, as well as key resource books on extant garments. I guess I would call what I do intuitive sewing plus research, or maybe research plus intuition. Thank you for joining me on my first Française adventure. I think I succeeded in meeting the macaron challenge, except for the big hair. I need to work on that. And creating a gown that emulates Madame de Pompadour's gown in that painting, fancy French patisserie desserts, and the beautiful food art of the Great British Bake Off. I love this gown and all the trim. The color is so cheerful, especially during these winter pandemic quarantine days. And I look forward to wearing it at some point with friends like Christine and my other buddies in the St. Louis Historical Sewing Society and the Indiana Historical Costuming Society. Someday, my dears, someday.